All right, assalamu alaikum. So this lesson is, I think, 7.03, I believe. So this one is about the digestive system and the excretory system. Right. So the digestive system is very important for, for all animals, um, in order to, take in food and then digest it, break it down into individual small parts. And so when you break it down into the small parts, then you can reassemble it in your own body to make your own kind of human cells, right? So if someone eats, like some spinach, right, you want to break that down into the individual carbohydrates and proteins and different things so that you can build your own cells, right? So we don't have much use for, spinach cells or spinach proteins specifically, right? So we want to break those things down and then use it to make our own things, right? So this over here is just, saying that humans and many animals release many waste products through feces. So the digestive system, right, produces waste products, right? So it's a part of the excretory system. When people think of the excretory system, usually they think of the urinary system, the kidneys, but the excretory system contains the parts of the body that produce urine, but also other kinds of waste products as well, right? So this over here, you guys can read. This is talking about, how different kinds of animals produce all different kinds of, waste. Like it says, rabbits can produce 500 droppings per day. Do you still want that cute bunny as a pet? All right, so different kinds of things you guys can read through over here. And there's, I guess, just random interesting facts. So let's talk a little bit about, the digestive system. We're going to start with the digestive system. So food, that we eat, right, is broken down into its individual parts. So it contains many different kinds of things. Some of those things are called macronutrients, as we've already discussed before. Things like protein, carbohydrates, lipids. All right, these kinds of things are called macronutrients. There's also micronutrients. There's also, certain kinds of small vitamins and minerals that are a small portion of what we eat, but they're very necessary. So we have macronutrients and we have micronutrients. So the digestive system, right, starts at the mouth and ends all the way at the rectum and the anus, right? So the entire span is used to digest and process food. So it's a very, very complex process. So this picture here on the left is showing you the entire system, right? So now, not all of these parts, right, contain food within them, or food does not pass through all of these parts. So it passes through the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and the large intestine, and ends up in the rectum. But some of these organs, like for example these ones over here that you see, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, these are also part of the digestive system, but the food does not actually go into the liver or into the gallbladder or into the pancreas. These are called accessory organs. So they kind of help and produce chemicals and different things that are secreted into the digestive tract that contains the food. All right. So the digestive system consists of different parts. The food does not pass through all of those organs. These three organs over here, the food does not actually go through them. All right, so the food begins at the mouth. So the mouth, is important for many different reasons. First of all, it provides, some, basic. It begins the digestive process. So the first thing that it does is it provides mechanical digestion. So the teeth and the movement of the mouth, right, crushes and grinds the food into tiny pieces. Right? Now, most of what the mouth does is mechanical, right? It takes a large piece of food and breaks it down into tiny pieces, right? So that's a physical process, right? Now, in terms of the chemical process, there's a little bit that begins in the mouth, right? So over here in the mouth, as you're chewing the food, there are different kinds of salivary glands that exist. So we're not going to go over the different types, but you can see the names over here. So there's different kinds of salivary glands that exist, and through different ducts, they produce saliva. So the saliva helps in the physical digestion, right? If you take food and you put water into it, right, it's going to become softer. And it will be easier for you to break down the food into tiny pieces. But the saliva also contains some enzymes, right? The most important one, which is called amylase, and this begins the breakdown of carbohydrates through chemical digestion. So, for example, over here you can see that starch is broken down by this enzyme called amylase. So amylase is inside the saliva, right? So most of what the mouth does is physical, but there is some chemical digestion that begins. And remember, starch is basically made up of sugars. Each of these red things is one sugar. Is one glucose molecule, which is a sugar. And you put them all together and you get this carbohydrate. So amylase begins to break it down. So saliva does different kinds of things, right? So it has it has some buffering capacity. So what does that mean? It means that saliva helps in maintaining the pH of the mouth and the food. So a buffer is something that prevents change in pH, right? It stops things from becoming too acidic or too basic. Kind of keeps things, where it's supposed to be, kind of in the middle. It also has some antibacterial effect as well. So the saliva, right, it produces an enzyme called lysozyme, which kills bacteria. So that's why, like the teeth, so that helps to, so that has, some effect on preventing cavities. So for example, they say that, babies, they produce a lot of saliva. Like if you see a baby, it's always like drooling and like saliva is always coming out. So that's why they say that for babies, it's not as important to like brush their teeth and that kind of thing, because there's so much saliva, and that saliva is constantly killing bacteria. So as a person starts to grow, then there's less and less saliva that is produced. In addition, that's why when you go to sleep at night, the saliva stops, right? So when you wake up the next morning, then that's why you have to especially brush your teeth right away, right? So throughout the day, the mouth is producing saliva, but at night it's basically stopped. So that's why bacteria can grow especially well during the night when someone goes to sleep. So that's why you have to brush the teeth, especially during the nighttime. And it has other kinds of things as well. So they're giving you this example, right? So they're telling you to try something. So go ahead and try this out if you have this with you. So take they're saying take some kind of saltine cracker or something like that, right? So it's probably better to take a cracker that doesn't have any salt on it. Just take a cracker, it's made of carbohydrates, right? Most of a cracker is just made of carbohydrates, from grains or whatever it is. So take that cracker and chew on it. All right. It also works with like a French fry because it's made of potatoes. So take the cracker and just chew it, and just keep chewing it and keep chewing it in your mouth. And you'll notice that the cracker initially will be kind of like a bland taste, but eventually you'll taste it becoming sweet. And the reason is because the starch is going to be broken down into sugars that you can actually taste. Okay. Now, in the mouth, you also have the tongue, and the tongue is important for moving food around and eventually helping you to swallow. All right. So let's take a look at this picture over here. So this kind of just shows you how the tongue kind of helps to push food back. This is called a bolus of food, right? So this piece of food that that you're about to swallow is called a bolus. So the bolus of food is pushed by the tongue into the back of the mouth, and then into the back here, which is called the pharynx. All right. So this part here is called the pharynx. So this part is the mouth, and this part is the pharynx. So the bolus goes down here into the pharynx, and you see there's two tubes here. Okay. So there's going to be one tube, which is the windpipe over here. All right. And then in the back, you have the esophagus. So obviously you want the food to go down the esophagus into the stomach, and not down the windpipe. So what helps to close the windpipe? When you swallow, the structure called the epiglottis automatically blocks that windpipe, and so the food goes down the esophagus and does not go down the windpipe. So you can see in the second picture that the windpipe to the lungs, the trachea, is actually blocked. So food cannot go down that way. Right? So this is very, so multiple, so the mouth is doing all kinds of very, very complex kinds of things. There's a lot of things going on here. This shows you, the whole process from the beginning to the end in the mouth to the stomach. So you swallow over here, it goes down to the pharynx and goes down the esophagus. So the esophagus, right, the very, top portion, right, the top portion is different from the bottom portion. But basically the esophagus is lined with muscles. So why is the esophagus, this tube, lined with muscles? Well, once this bolus of food goes down here into the esophagus, well, you want to push it down all the way into the stomach. Now, you don't want to just hang out here and stay here in the esophagus. So the esophagus is lined with all kinds of muscles, and those muscles, they help to push the food all the way down and make sure it goes into the stomach. In addition, there's two kind of circular muscles, one here at the top called upper esophageal sphincter, and one here at the bottom between the esophagus and the stomach, lower esophageal sphincter. So what is the purpose of this? So the purpose of this is to block the esophagus when you're not swallowing food. So let's say the food goes all the way down and ends up in the stomach. Well, then this lower esophageal sphincter basically closes off. Okay, so it closes off. It stays shut. So why is that important? Because you don't want the food in the stomach and the acid in the stomach to start going back up into the esophagus. All right. So we talked about the esophagus. So it's telling us that it takes about 5 to 10 seconds for the food to go down the esophagus. Right. So this whole process that we talked about takes maybe like 5 to 10 seconds. All right. So we have the stomach. So the stomach does a lot of different kinds of things. All right. So the stomach, first of all, is it produces acid. All right. So they call it gastric acid or hydrochloric acid. So stomach acid, right, is very, very acidic. So this right over here, you see this color chart? This is called a pH scale. So right here in the middle, 7, this is water. This is basically neutral. So you would say this is not acidic or basic. This is just exactly kind of in the middle. All right. Now anything in the higher numbers, say 8, 9, 10, 11, the higher it goes, the more basic it becomes, or you could say the more alkaline it is. Right? So for example, like milk, for example, is probably here, somewhere. It's more basic. All right. And then things that are acidic, right, like lemon juice and stuff like that, are down here. So the lower the number gets, the more acidic it is. So for example, a tomato has a pH of 4. I think lemon or limes are somewhere over here. And then stomach is all the way down here. So you can see that stomach acid is one of the most acidic things that we normally come into contact with. So stomach acid is very acidic. So what does the acid do? Well, it does different kinds of things, but it helps to kind of break down the food. That's one of the things it does. It also has some effect on the enzymes that are produced in the stomach. So the stomach, right, produces enzymes. So remember when we were talking about proteins. So what are enzymes? Enzymes are basically proteins that can do something, right? They're proteins that basically they can do all kinds of different things. They can break down things, build things up. They're basically kind of like protein machines. Okay, so in the stomach, right, you have different kinds of enzymes. So the most important one, they're mentioning 2 here, but the important one that we need to know is called pepsin. All right, so when the food hits the stomach, remember in the mouth, the carbohydrates began to be digested with the amylase enzyme. When it goes out into the stomach, then you begin digesting proteins using pepsin. So pepsin splits proteins into small peptides. So remember, proteins are made up of a chain of amino acids. So this enzyme pepsin breaks down the protein into smaller and smaller pieces. Right? Now there's many other enzymes later on that also continue to break down protein. Right? But this is the beginning of the process. In the stomach, this thing over here, right, pepsin, starts to break down proteins. Now the stomach is is surrounded by muscles. So just like the esophagus has muscles, the stomach in its wall, right, has a lot of muscles in it. So what is the purpose of these muscles? Well, the purpose is to churn and break down the food and mix it all together. So this is for two purposes. First of all, just like the mouth, right? Just like in the mouth, you break down the food physically. The stomach churning also breaks down the food physically. All right. So the stomach, look over here. This part of the stomach is contracting. Then later on, this part contracts. So when different parts of the stomach start contracting and moving, it starts to break down the food even more. In addition, remember we've added these enzymes and we've added acid into the food. So in order for all those enzymes and the acid to work on the food, you have to mix the food with the acid, right? Like if I take a chemical and put it on the food to digest it, well, I need to mix all that together to make sure the enzyme can work on all the food. So the stomach doing all this mixes all the food and the enzymes together. So the enzyme is everywhere in the food and can start working and breaking down all that food. All right? So that's the main thing that happens. Now, remember we said that the stomach has the stomach produces very strong acid. Okay, so you would think that that could be damaging to the stomach, right? Like if you just take acid and pour it on your skin or something like that, that'll start to break down the skin and damage the skin or damage anything else, right? So how does the stomach protect itself? How come the stomach doesn't digest itself with its own acid and its own enzymes? Well, the stomach is lined by a layer of mucus, all right? So this word here, mucus. So the stomach is lined by a layer of mucus that coats the stomach on the inside. So inside the stomach, there's a layer of this mucus. And so when the acid is chewing everything up, the mucus is protecting the stomach wall from actually being digested and destroying itself. All right? So another important thing to remember is this word chyme. All right? So we talked about this food being churned and digested. So this substance, right, this churned up food and everything else, this is called chyme, chyme, right? So this word here called chyme, chyme. So that whole mix of broken down food and enzymes and acid and everything, this is called chyme. So the stomach can figure out when all of this is churned up and ready to keep going on. And so when that happens, then there's this kind of valve that exists here between the stomach and the next portion, which is the small intestine. And so when the stomach decides, hey, we're ready to send it along, this valve opens, and then the chyme can slowly it doesn't all just go at one time. One portion at a time, it sends it through to the next phase. So the next phase the next portion that we're going to send the food to is called the small intestine. All right. So right over here we have the stomach, right? We have the esophagus into the stomach over here, and then it goes to this very long portion called the small intestine. So notice that this is very long, right? You see, like it's wrapping, inside and over itself, many times again and again and again, all over the place. So the small intestine is very long. If you were to stretch this out, it would be, very long. So the small intestine is composed of three main parts. You have the duodenum right over here. That's the beginning portion. The next portion is called the jejunum. And then the last portion at the very end, before it goes into the large intestine, is called the ileum. All right? So the first portion connected to the stomach is duodenum. In the middle, jejunum. All the way at the end, ileum. All right? So what does the small intestine do? All right, what do these different portions do? Well, first of all, they are also lined by muscles. All right? So this is not skeletal muscle, the same way, like the biceps and the lats and all those kinds of things that you can actually move, these are smooth muscles. So the small intestine, it breaks the food down again and again and again using these muscles, right? So it takes that chyme that came from the stomach and continues to break it down using the physical process. In addition, a lot more enzymes are added at this point. So that, remember, the mouth added amylase, the stomach added pepsin, and possibly small amounts of other things. But the small intestine, right, this is where a whole lot of enzymes are added. Okay, so like a bunch of enzymes are added, and that starts to break down proteins, carbohydrates, fats, right? It starts to break down everything, right? So it breaks down everything into tiny, tiny, tiny pieces, and then the small intestine absorbs most of the nutrients that you need. All right, so most of the small intestine is the main place where digestion occurs by enzymes, and it is the main place where all those broken down things are absorbed and taken up by the body. Right? So carbohydrates are broken down and taken up. Proteins are broken down and taken up. Lipids like fats are broken down and taken up. Many kinds of vitamins, minerals are also taken up in this area. Now, now the different portions, right? We talked about these different portions. So these different portions, they are divided up because they have different characteristics. So that, for example, we're going to talk about the jejunum versus the ileum. So these two things are not just kind of arbitrarily given different names. They have differences between them. So what is the difference between the jejunum and the ileum? So this picture over here shows you, one difference, or some differences. So this one at the top is the jejunum, right? Remember, the jejunum is the part in the middle, right? And then the ileum is going to be the next picture, right? So the ileum is down here, right? So this right over here is the jejunum. This is the ileum. So notice the difference in the inside the jejunum, right? So this difference you can see here in the surface of the jejunum versus the smooth surface of the ileum. So the jejunum has all of these tiny folds inside and out all over the place. And so why is that advantageous? Well, that increases the surface area by which the food can be absorbed. All right, because the food can go. If you travel, let's say let's say you have a some piece of carbohydrate is traveling along all these little folds inside and out, over and over and over and over and over again. Right? Well, it's going to take a long time for it to travel this entire length. Right? But if it goes along this smooth road, it's going to go through very quickly. Right? So imagine that you're going from like, let's say from Kendall down to Homestead, right? And let's say you take, right, so that distance is whatever it is, maybe like 20-30 miles. So let's say you take a straight road there, right, like the ileum, right? You just take a straight road from here in one direction straight to Homestead. All right, so it's going to take you a certain amount of time. Now, let's suppose you're going that same, let's say you want to go from Kendall to Homestead, but this time you take a road, right, still going from Kendall to Homestead. The origin point and the end point is still the same. But in between, the road is not straight, right? So let's say the road is like curving back and forth, constantly is curving back and forth, up and down, back and forth, from Kendall all the way to Homestead. Well, even though you're going from Kendall to Homestead on both roads, the road that's curved and goes back and forth, that's going to be, if you kind of stretch it out, that's going to be a much, much longer road. So that's the same way the jejunum versus the ileum works. The ileum is like the smooth road, has less surface area. The jejunum, with all of these up and down folds, has a lot of surface area. So that's important because you want more surface area to absorb more food, more nutrients and minerals. Right? So if we take a look at these folds, right, here are all these folds inside, and let's say we zoom in on them. Well, we're going to see, right, these folds here. that increases the surface area. Now, these large, projections are called villi. All right, that's what you can actually see. Right, but let's say we zoom in. Right, let's say we zoom in on the villi you can't really see. The villi are these are kind of these finger-like projections on the folds, right? So the villi are still relatively large, right? But let's say we take each of these individual little folds that we see here and we zoom in on it, right? You see this little box? We're going to zoom in and look at it, with a microscope. So let's say we zoom in on this villi. Well, each of these cells, if you zoom in on it, has its own folds called microvilli. So you see how the surface area is going to be multiplied, right? First of all, you have these large folds that add more surface area. Then each of these folds has villi, right? So that multiplies the surface area. Then each of these villi has all of these microvilli. So that multiplies the surface area many, many, many times, right? So the food is flowing in here, right? The food is flowing in here, and it's constantly going by these villi and by these microvilli. Now, when it goes through here, right? Each of these cells can absorb different things: amino acids, carbohydrates, vitamins. And so when it absorbs that nutrient, it passes through the cell and goes on the other side over here. And inside, you have these blood vessels. So the nutrient goes inside of the blood and then can be carried to the rest of the body. All right? So that's how the intestines absorbs different kinds of nutrients. It has all of these different folds that increase the surface area, and when it absorbs the food or whatever nutrient, it then goes into the blood. There's blood vessels inside of here that take that nutrient, like vitamin C or amino acids or sugar, and sends it to the rest of the body so the whole body can use it. Right? So in the small intestine, a lot of things are absorbed and most of the nutrients are taken up. Right? So it says, by the time the chyme leaves the small intestine, it is depleted of most of its nutrients. Most of the nutrients, the absorption is done, leaving only water, cellulose, and other undigestible substances behind. So once you pass the small intestine, very few things that you need and can still absorb are left. Most of what's left is going to be waste products. All right. So let's see what happens when we go to the large intestine. So the large intestine looks like this, right? So right over here, this is where the small intestine connects to the large intestine. So the small intestine has absorbed most of the nutrients, and it passes all the waste products and whatever is left here into the cecum, right? And it travels through the large intestine until it gets expelled as feces, right? So what happens in the large intestine? Well, the large intestine basically absorbs a lot of water, right? So the body doesn't really like to lose water. It tries to conserve water wherever it can, in the kidneys or in the intestines. So the large intestine starts to absorb all the water, or most of the water. And so what's left at the end is relatively dry compared to what went into the beginning of the large intestine. All right? Right? So the large intestine basically absorbs most of the water, right? And let's suppose you don't absorb enough of the water, right? Let's suppose the water is not absorbed for whatever reason. Maybe there's some kind of bacteria or disease that's causing water not to be absorbed. Then that's called diarrhea, right? And let's say too much is absorbed and it's too dry, and the person has a problem going to the bathroom. That's called constipation, right? Now, one important additional thing is that the large intestine is filled with bacteria. Okay. Now, most of these bacteria are good bacteria, right? So the body actually needs good bacteria in the large intestines, right? So That's why, for example, if you've ever heard of like probiotics, people take a lot of probiotics. Also, yogurt has good bacteria, so people often take these kinds of supplements. There's like people sell different kinds of pills that are filled with bacteria. These are good bacteria. So when they take the pills and it goes down into the large intestine, then those good bacteria can go and replenish the good bacteria in the large intestine. So there's some confusion, or there's some questions about whether this actually works or doesn't work, or how much it works. Maybe it only works a little bit. Maybe it's difficult to change the bacteria in the large intestine using these probiotics. If you also eat different kinds of foods, people say that it helps good bacteria to grow. Yogurt also has good bacteria in it. Right? If you ever look on the side of yogurt, right, look to see what it says. Right, it could say that it has live and active cultures. Right, so if that's the case, that means that the yogurt still has the bacteria in it that was used to make the yogurt. So if you take milk and you put in certain kinds of bacteria, it produces yogurt. Right. So oftentimes, that's one good reason to eat yogurt. Right. Now, another thing that these bacteria do. So one important thing that these bacteria do is that they produce vitamin K. Right. So vitamin K, right? You can eat vitamin K from different kinds of foods, but also a lot of the bacteria that live in the intestines, they produce vitamin K. Right. Now this over here, right? So when we talk about good bacteria, right? The good bacteria, when you have enough of the good bacteria, they crowd out bad bacteria. Like let's suppose some bad bacteria gets in there, right? If you have a good structure of good bacteria, if you have a good ecosystem of good bacteria, then the bad bacteria is going to have a much more difficult time getting established in the intestines. All right. So one kind of bacteria, that could infect the intestines is called E. coli. People often have, like food poisoning and stuff like that. So that can cause, and then they have vomiting and diarrhea. That's caused by different kinds of bacteria. One kind of bacteria that can cause that is called E. coli. All right. So now there's different types of E. coli. Right. You've probably heard of this, like like maybe someone was selling spinach at the supermarket and it was contaminated with E. coli, something like that. So there's different kinds of E. coli, right? Some strains are okay and they don't cause much sickness. Other strains, they actually are damaging and can cause problems. So whenever you see the name of a bacteria, there's not just one type of that bacteria. There's different strains. Some strains are worse than others. Some strains, they don't do anything. Other strains, they're very invasive and they can cause infections. All right. So sometimes people, they eat something that's contaminated with a bad strain of E. coli. And that E. coli can do one of two things. One, it could produce a lot of toxins, right? And then the body can have like a bad reaction to the toxins, and that causes like diarrhea or vomiting. The second thing it could do is that the bacteria itself, not just by producing chemicals called toxins, but the bacteria itself could start to invade the wall of the intestines. And so when that happens, then people can get blood in their diarrhea. Right? So that's very important to try and prevent. Right? So overall, this is the overall structure of the digestive system. So the digestive system absorbs nutrients, it absorbs minerals, it can even produce certain kinds of vitamins as well. Right? So then at the end, the feces are stored in the rectum and expelled through the anus. All right. All right. Now we're going to take a look at these three organs over here. So far what we've talked about are all the organs that the food passes through. Right? The food passes through the mouth, the food passes through the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. So there's three other important organs. Right over here we have the pancreas, right? Now this tube going over here is the small intestine, okay? So the pancreas can, can be attached to it. So we have the pancreas, we have the gallbladder here. Maybe you've heard people can have like gallstones and stuff like that. And then you have the liver, all right, which is below the lungs. So right over here is the diaphragm, and above that would be the lungs. All right, so the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Now these are very important, all right, because they produce important chemicals and enzymes that are used in digestion. All right, and it does a couple other things as well. But the food doesn't actually pass through these three organs, and so these are not. So these are called accessory organs of digestion, right? So what do these different things do, right? So this over here tells us about the pancreas, right? So the pancreas, remember, is attached to the small intestine. So the pancreas, one of the important things that it does is that it produces enzymes that digest the food. So these are three of the main enzymes that it produces. There's different, there's different names that they have, but these are the three, main types. So you have enzymes that digest carbohydrates, you have enzymes that digest protein, and enzymes that digest fat and break down fat. All right. So the pancreas produces these enzymes and puts them into the intestine. So remember, the food is flowing through here in the small intestine. So the enzyme, if it secretes these enzymes into the intestine, it's going to come into contact with all that food and start to break it down. Right? Now, the liver, right? The liver and gallbladder, they work together. So the liver produces something called bile, right? So the liver produces bile and it secretes it. You see these like tubes coming out from the liver? It secretes it and stores it in the gallbladder. All right? So the liver is always producing bile. So it's producing bile, and then it stores it in the gallbladder. Now, when a person eats some kind of food and it has fat in it, then the bile is secreted into the intestines. So what does bile do? All right. So this is like a fat globule. All right. So what is that? That's like a big circle full of fat molecules. Right. So in order to digest fat, we need bile salts. So why is that the case? So the other things that we absorb, carbohydrates, proteins, remember those kinds of things, those things are mostly water soluble. That means that they can dissolve easily and break down in water. But fat kind of sticks together. Like for example, if you've ever taken like a glass and put in water, and then on top you put in oil, right? The two, they don't really mix. So if you have fat, it also is not going to mix with water. So if it doesn't mix with water, then how are you going to absorb it? So what you need is these bile salts. And these bile salts, what they do is that they take the fat globule and they break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And so then each of those pieces can be absorbed with the bile salt. Otherwise, the fat is just going to go right through and not be absorbed. Now, the appendix, right? The appendix is one part of the digestive system where it's not really clear what exactly it does, right? So let's take a look at this picture again. Here's the large intestine, right? So right over here, we have the appendix, right over here. So maybe some of you guys have heard of appendicitis. So what is appendicitis? Is basically an infection of the appendix. So maybe something gets stuck here and bacteria starts to grow and it can cause, an infection. So when it causes an infection, then, that can lead to fever, and sometimes the infection can spread, and in really bad cases, it can form, like some kind of like abscess or something, like some kind of collection of fluid, and maybe it can burst and the infection can spread. So all different kinds of complications can occur if the appendix is infected. So what does the appendix do? Well, it's not clear what exactly it does. So it probably has some functions, but most of the time it probably doesn't do very much. But one thing that it can do is that, remember we said that the large intestine is filled with good bacteria, right? Now, when someone, let's see, there's an infection, right, and the person has diarrhea. Well, a lot of that bacteria is lost because water is constantly flowing through, flushing out all that good bacteria. So once the diarrhea ends, well, you need to repopulate the large intestine with the good bacteria again. So the appendix usually has a reserve of good bacteria in it, and when the infection ends, the good bacteria goes back and repopulates the large intestine, right? So that the good bacteria can go back in. So that's one thing that they believe that that it does, right? So it also says that in some other creatures, right, in some mammals, this organ helps to digest cellulose, right, which is basically from plants, it's basically like plant material, and other substances that are difficult to digest. So probably in humans, it doesn't really do that, but it says in some creatures it can do that, right? The appendix is also thought to be part of the immune system, so it can contribute to the body's defenses as well, right? So usually when people remove the appendix, most of the time there's not really any problems. Usually the person can live like a normal life without really needing their appendix. All right, now let's talk about the excretory system. So what does excretory means? It means to kind of, put something outside, right? To excrete. So the excretory system is composed of different parts. And all of these portions, what do? They get rid of things. They get rid of waste products. Now the skin is part of the excretory system. So what does the skin get rid of? What waste product does the skin produce and eliminate from the body? So it produces sweat, right? So sweat contains different chemicals that the body wants to get rid of. It also gets rid of, it also gets rid of salts and different things like that, right? It has other purposes, like it helps you to cool down and that kind of thing. But the sweat all contains different things that the body wants to get rid of, right? The lungs. The lungs are also part of the excretory system. So what does the lungs try to get rid of from the body, right? So it takes in oxygen and it gets rid of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a waste product, and the lungs takes in the oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide, right? The liver, right? So the liver does a couple of different things, right? Remember we talked about the liver produces bile, right? So that's one thing that it does. But the liver also helps to remove waste products from the body. So one thing that it does is that it takes proteins. It takes the byproducts of proteins and breaks it down into something called urea, which later on goes into the urine, right? So the liver can produce urea, which then goes into the urine and is eliminated, right? In addition, it also has a lot of different kinds of enzymes that breaks down different kinds of toxins. So for example, like let's suppose someone takes some medicine, right? There's different kinds of medicines that when they're absorbed, the body sometimes thinks that, okay, these are toxins, and it starts to use the liver to break it down and get rid of it. So when you give someone a medicine, you have to take that into account. You have to decide, okay, how quickly is the liver going to break this down, right? Like how long is this medicine going to work, right? So when you know that, okay, the liver has broken it all down, then you have to give another dose of that medicine, right? So the liver, the things that the digestive system absorbs goes through the liver, and the liver can, break down a lot of the things that it thinks are toxins, right? So this just shows that the liver produces urea, and the urea then goes to the kidneys and goes out in the urine. So the liver and the kidneys, they work together. Now, what do the kidneys do, right? So this is the kidney. These are the kidneys, right? So you have two kidneys, and these are basically in the, they're located basically behind the digestive system. So they're located, near your back. All right. So you have two kidneys. Right? You have a right kidney and a left kidney. Right? And they're connected to the blood. Right? So there are arteries that come off of the of this aorta over here, and then goes into the kidneys, and the kidneys basically filters and cleans the blood, and then sends it back into the veins. Right? So the kidney is basically the place where the blood is filtered, right? And a lot of toxic things are taken out. So how does the kidney work? So this is the kidney, right? So blood comes in with waste products, it's filtered through, and the clean blood goes back. So let's say we zoom in on this structure over here. Right? If we zoom in on the structure over here, this is what it's going to kind of look like. Right? So it has this basic thing called a nephron. That's the basic unit of the kidney. Right? So the nephron is the basic unit of the kidney. Right? So how does the nephron work? Right? This whole long thing, this is the nephron. Right? So here's what happens. You have this place called the glomerulus, and that's where blood goes into the nephron. Right? So a lot of the blood and the water and everything is filtered through and goes into the nephron. And basically over the course of this whole nephron, this long nephron, right? What happens? All the things that the body wants to keep are basically taken back. Right? So in the glomerulus, a lot of the water and substances are basically thrown into the nephron. Right? That includes good things and bad things. Right? So then throughout, as this fluid flows through the nephron, then the good things are taken back. Right? So the body takes back the good things and leaves the waste products inside the nephron. And eventually it makes its way into the urine. Right? And then once it goes into the urine, it goes down these things called ureters. Right? So all of those, from the nephrons, all the urine goes down here into this thing called the pelvis and into the ureter, and the ureters go down, the two ureters go down into the bladder, and from the bladder it goes down into the urethra, and that is eliminated from the body. Right? So these things here are called ureters. Right? Ureter. That's different from urethra. Right? So those are two different things. So from the kidney to the bladder, it's called ureter. From the bladder to the outside is called urethra. Right? So this is how the kidney works and helps to clean the blood.